Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and in today's discussion we are taking a look at the first 12 days of the 3.10 Delirium League meta. We will be taking a look at ascendancies as well as popular skills and taking a look lastly at different popular weapon setups and configurations in the current 3.10 Delirium League. If you are new to the channel, you can go ahead and like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about more video discussions just like this one. And if at any point in time you've got a comment, any feedback, or a suggestion, feel free to leave them down below. At the end of the video, we'll give you 3 discussion questions that we'll be focused in on during today's discussion.
You are the sculptor, crafting your destiny with the clay of mind, body, and purpose.
Well, it is by far one of my favorite projects to take a look at this chart each and every league. Early on, within the first few weeks, we get some information about what players decided on their league starters. This is, of course, a comparison chart between Softcore Delirium, that is in the top in yellow, and Hardcore Delirium League, which is down below, and that's the layout of the popular ascendancies in each of those respective leagues, whether it's softcore or hardcore. We do have some helpful components here that help tell us whether or not a particular ascendancy was more popular in softcore than hardcore, or more popular in hardcore than softcore, or if there was no change whatsoever. For instance, the Trickster ascendancy in softcore is taking the top spot at 13% presently in Delirium Softcore. This is no doubt thanks to the league itself as a mechanic being very, very densely packed with monsters and lending itself to most notably Essence Drain Contagion, but many other builds that are going to take advantage of closely grouped together monsters. In Hardcore, you can see taking the top spot is the Necromancer, the tried and true jack of all trades, do whatever kind of content you want and shape your build around that content style of ascendancy. The Necromancer in Hardcore is coming in at 16% in terms of popularity, which many of us predicted the Necromancer would actually suffer a bit of a setback. And there has been something of a setback, but I do just want to highlight for our conversation purposes today, the percentages early on in Metamorph were actually relatively similar to these percentages until eventually a dominant meta with a couple of dominant meta builds emerged as more and more players were farming the Conquerors and farming Cirrus. This will most likely once again happen here in Delirium League, where there are a few meta builds that will take over the next few couple of weeks, but for now we at least have some present diversity among the top spots with no single individual dominant ascendancy taking over the limelight and pushing the rest of ascendancies down by the wayside. But more on that in a few moments. A couple other major notable changes and differences are between the Assassin in Softcore and in Hardcore. Of course, the Assassin as an ascendancy doesn't come with very many defensive tools, and the defensive tools that are at its disposal don't necessarily lend themselves to preventing one-shots, which is what much of the Hardcore player base is concerned about. In Hardcore, Juggernaut takes a much higher spot than it does in Softcore, as many players are trying to speed through as much content as they can in Softcore, whereas in Hardcore the objective is much more oriented around not dying. Chieftain is also another one of those bigger spreads just in terms of its spot on the popularity list, but in terms of actual player differences, we're talking about only a few points here or there. A couple of popular ascendancies are cropping up in both softcore and hardcore, those being the Champion and the Gladiator. Both are seeing healthy amounts of play in both softcore and hardcore leagues. Both have got a good mixture of either AoE, bossing, or defensive layers that are provided through their ascendancies. And so you can see that players are choosing to play those particular ascendancies either in a more offensive-oriented fashion in general in softcore and in a more defensive-oriented fashion in general in hardcore. If this is your first time looking at our chart or joining us for this discussion, one thing to note is very, very often classes that are more speed-oriented classes will pick up in their popularity, even if there's not a massive shift in the player base towards a particular meta build that is going to dictate one ascendancy move way up the charts later on into the league. I fully expect things like Deadeye, Pathfinder, Ascendant, and even Berserker to come up in the charts in both leagues as the league progresses and as more and more players gather more and more currency to then sink into speedier and faster builds that will be able to farm, tankier, and more efficiently take down herds of mobs. Looking back at our last 2 leagues and comparing Delirium to Metamorph, we can see a couple of trends emerging. For instance, the data that was taken on our chart for this particular comparison during Metamorph League was taken just after the first week of Metamorph had wrapped up. At that time, Saboteur, Necromancer, and Trickster came in at the top spots, the top 3 spots for Softcore Metamorph. But really, Saboteur and Necromancer stood way out from the pack at 21 and 20% respectively. And that was also true in Hardcore, where 25% of the player base were playing Necromancer and 11% of the player base were playing Saboteur. This is precisely the sort of data that I'm referencing when I say that things look a bit more balanced presently, simply because looking back at a roughly similar timetable within about a week to 2 weeks of a league launch, in Delirium you can see that while Necromancer is still at the top of Hardcore, it's not nearly as top heavy for Necromancer. Champion has come way up at 14%, whereas in Hardcore Metamorph it was at 6%. And in Softcore leagues, while the Necromancer and the Saboteur still remain solid options, they are not dominating 40% of the player base. The most shocking part about this is that we're in somewhat of a state of balance. We made this remark during the 3.9 Metamorph overview during that first week, that we were at a stage where we were pretty similarly balanced. There was some massive top-heavy aspects of that particular meta, most notably early on the Saboteur and the Necromancer, but for the most part outside of that, we were relatively close together in terms of popularity, spread out across the different ascendancies. This can also be said for today, where Delirium is once again moving us a bit closer to where each and every ascendancy offers something unique and interesting for players to choose from, and that is making each and every ascendancy class viable and an option for players to play, rather than 1 to 3 ascendancies dominating everyone's choices.
To fear the unknown is to forego many a gratifying delight.
This is an entirely new feature of our discussion, so if you've been around for our previous meta overviews, we wanted to take a look this go around during Delirium League at character popularity. So this is something where we're taking a look at whether it's in Softcore Delirium League, above my slightly balding forehead, or Hardcore Delirium League, that's going to be the row of characters down below my elongated geriatric beard. For each of these character classes, what I've done is I've gone through and I've taken a look at each of their ascendancies and combined their ascendancy popularity into a character popularity percentage. So starting off in Softcore, we've got the Marauder coming in at just under 5%, the Duelist at 24%, the Ranger at 5%, the Shadow at 33%, the Witch at 16%, the Templar at 14%, and the Scion at a measly 2%. Now we might look at that spectrum and say that's a pretty wide spectrum in between the Shadow at the top end at 33% and the Scion down at the bottom at 2%. That's a pretty wide spectrum of popularity. But that being said, that spectrum is actually pretty well evenly distributed between the Duelist, the Shadow, the Witch, and the Templar. It's relatively close in terms of the ascendancies and the choices that players are making between those 4 character classes, and that's a pretty balanced state for the game when you consider that each of those characters is coming from a slightly different starting spot on the tree. Compare that with Hardcore, where we have the Marauder at 12% popularity, the Duelist at 27%, the Ranger at just under 4%, the Shadow at 18%, the Witch at 23%, the Templar at 16%, and the Scion at 1%. There is a bit tighter of a spectrum between Scion at 1% and between Duelist at 27%, but we also see a bit of a flip in between what is most popular between Softcore to Hardcore. Again, the differences in player goals and the differences in the essential reality that in one of these leagues you'll lose your character if you make a mistake. Despite the differences in between penalizing players between Softcore and Hardcore, the similarities are some of the things that are very interesting here. Ranger in both Softcore and Hardcore Delirium is relatively low on the totem pole. Shadow and Duelist are relatively high on the totem pole. Witch, Templar are also relatively high on the totem pole, with the biggest changes coming in Delirium being mostly around items in skills and passive tree rather than localized to individual ascendancies. It's really interesting to take note at these particular character popularity numbers to get a wide range of opinion of players in what it is that they are playing. For instance, while it's helpful to take a look and see that, let's say, the Necromancer is dominating most Witch players' choices, it's not as helpful to take a look at the Shadow when we consider that both the Saboteur as well as the Assassin are just as popular or close to being as popular as the Saboteur.
Precious gems are forged by heat and pressure. Let's take a look at the popular skills in Softcore Delirium and in Hardcore Delirium.
You can tell at the very top, Cyclone is once again dominating both boards because of its utility. You can use it in any way you want. You can use it as something to proc another skill thanks to cast while channeling. You can use it as a main damage skill. You can use it as a support skill while you are helping other players, boosting their effectiveness. Cyclone is truly the jack of all trades skill that is being used regardless of what league, and it is coming in at the top spot due to its smoothness and enjoyability of play. Coming in at the second spot in both leagues is Stormbrand, which is simply ridiculous to play this league. It doesn't matter what ascendancy you're on, just smack a bunch of mana on your character, use Stormbrand, make sure that it's supported by Archmage support, and you're going to have a great time. After Stormbrand, though, we see some diversity between hardcore to softcore, with Essence Drain, Ball Lightning, and Lacerate coming in to round out the top 5 in softcore, whereas Vault of Dead, Lacerate, and Essence Drain come in to round out the top 5 of hardcore. You can see that the difference in terms of the percentages of what's popular to play are definitely well distributed after that Cyclone and Stormbrand sort of plateau. Everything else from there pretty much peters on out, and a lot of players are playing different things. Cyclone, in its vast opportunity for a utility skill, simply makes it the best option. And if you can jam Cyclone into your build, why the heck wouldn't you?
A throne is the most devious trap of them all.
Every league I talk about acro and phase acro, and it looks like 3.10 Delirium is going to be another one of those leagues. In softcore, you can see that the most popular keystones that are being taken right now are indeed phase acro and acro, simply because if you don't get hit, you don't have to worry about mitigating damage. Coming in at the top spots in hardcore, however, are Elemental Overload and Resolute Technique, alongside closely followed by Mind Over Matter. It really is quite interesting, and you can see it in the keystone breakdown, in the ascendancy choices, and the character choices, and eventually here in a moment in the weapon choices between players, that hardcore is very much a different game than softcore, and that I think is actually a good thing. Your goals become quite different depending on the style of gameplay that you are playing, and therefore the choices that you make are going to be vastly different. In softcore Delirium, for instance, Elemental Overload comes in with 10% of the league taking it, whereas in hardcore, 22% of the league is taking it. You can really see where players are trying to squeeze out every bit of defensive layers in hardcore as possible, whereas in softcore, you can really tell where players are trying to squeeze out every little bit of DPS that they possibly can, stacking more multipliers on top of more multipliers on top of increased damage, and you can see that where Pain Attunement is the third most popular choice right now in softcore Delirium League.
By the goddess, what ambition!
League, we also wanted to take a look at weapons and see how weapon setups were being used in the present league. And in softcore, wands and shields by far and away are taking the top spot at 22%, with bows taking the second spot at 17%, and then a sword dual wielding combination at 11%, which thank GGG that dual wielding, sword wielding bug is finally fixed. All of us out there who are playing Cyclone and using swords are given 2 thumbs up to the GGG staff for getting that bug corrected. Hallelujah, we can finally dual wield our swords with glee. Meanwhile, the top 3 spots in hardcore are wand, shield, mace shield, and then bow coming in actually at 10%. However, the most popular choice by far is wand and shield, and that makes sense when you actually look at the ascendancy breakdown, where a lot of players are playing either Stormbrand or some form of a necromancer or summoner or trapper, where wands and shields make themselves available in plenty to a lot of different playstyles. Since shield charge has now been allowed to be used with wands, this really opens up movement capabilities for players. If you'd like to use shield charge on long straightaways and then use something like flame dash or lightning warp, or even one of the dash skills, whether that's dash itself or frost blink, there's a whole host of different skills that are available to you with a wand and shield configuration to allow your character to stay as mobile as possible. Of course, the big tragedy when we do look at popular weapons are two-handed weapons. So staffs come in at 8% in softcore and 7% in hardcore. I would vastly guess that the most of those staff users are in fact staff users in order to boost specific spells and the specific rolls that you can get off of staffs as opposed to on other items early on in a league, particularly using unique staffs, things like Cane of Unraveling for chaos-based builds, but I'm sure we'll actually see those staff numbers drop as the league continues and as more meta builds make themselves available. At the bottom spot in both leagues are two-handed swords, or close to it, two-handed axes. Because why on earth would you play something that is going to take up a defensive slot in hardcore, for instance, simply for the sake of having a second 6-link? It's not worth it. Hopefully this is something that will change when Path of Exile 2 comes around and we have the changes to gems and the way how gems and jewels are going to socket themselves, the fact that we won't need fusings anymore, the fact that as we're hunting for different skill gems, we'll actually be able to find versions that are 6-linked and then essentially be able to have unlimited power with multiple different 6-link setups. But for now, we're just left with the option of, do you want an additional 6-link and lose out on a quiver or lose out on a shield or lose out on another weapon? Do you essentially want to handicap yourself and give yourself fewer stats on your character? The vast majority of players look at the options presented and the benefits presented by two-handers and simply say no. Well, thanks so much for watching today's video, everyone, and I hope you join in our discussion down below in the comments. First off, what are your impressions for the 3.10 meta thus far? What builds, classes, and ascendancies are exceeding your expectations? And lastly, weigh in on what builds, classes, and ascendancies are below your present expectations during the 3.10 Delirium League. Thanks again so much for watching, and I hope Delirium League is the league a Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.